y'all today? Well, I am just grateful and blessed to be with you all. Any time in Rainier Avenue Church is a time with family, and any time with people of faith is an opportunity to be in the house of God with brothers and sisters. And so I'm delighted to be moderating our time a bit today and helping to guide us along the trail. And I just want to echo what Pastor Peter said, that it's really my role, I see, is to create space and to invite us to create space for ourselves. And so before we get started, one of the ways I'm going to do that is just help you know a little bit about what's going to happen, and then I'm going to introduce the film. So a few notes before I get started. We're going to be screening a portion of the film, but we're going to see a large portion of the film. You'll miss about 15 to 20 minutes of it, which we're going to set in context with a discussion with one of the principal characters of the film once we're done. When you watch it, and I know you'll want to see it again, you may want to show it to others, you might want to host your own little film screening at your house. There'll be some information on the back table. If you get it, it has a code that will allow you to go in and see the film in its entirety. It'll last for 30 days, or you could just purchase the film if you really like it on Netflix, but there's a free way to view it for the next 30 days. Everybody get that? Excellent. The other thing is I just want to invite you to think about this film screening in a couple of ways. One, we're not suggesting that we can answer all the questions, and certainly with a film screening, we don't believe we could answer all the questions that we might have, but it's a great place for us to start, and I really want to invite you as you watch the film to see it as an opportunity to learn some things we might not know about the gun issue in our country, see it as an opportunity for solidarity and empathy, to see it as a way to think about our own journeys with this issue of gun violence and the ways that we relate to the characters, and even in the ways that we might not relate to the characters. And then the other thing is to see it as an opportunity for us to begin to collectively pray and think about what might we do as we think about this issue, which can just feel overwhelming at times, and I know it certainly did for me when I first got involved. After the screening, immediately after, Reverend Schenck and I will come up and we're going to have a Q&A, and so I'm going to introduce him to you now, and then you will see him immediately following the film. You'll see another principal character in the film. Her name is Lucy McBath, and she's actually running for Congress now, working on this very issue, and she wanted me to make sure that I expressed to the audience her regrets, because she would have loved to be here with us, to be in the conversation, furthering this issue that she cares so deeply about. A few words about Rob before we get started, and then I'll say a little bit when I introduce the film about him and his role in that as well. Dr. Rob Schenck has served as a minister to top government officials on Capitol Hill for 24 years. He has met privately and publicly with countless members of Congress, past and present, U.S. Supreme Court justices and other federal judges, and several presidents and many cabinet members, agency executives, and other executive branch officials. He really is a minister to some of the top leaders in our country. His mission is to bring classical Christian moral instruction into the conversation and debate surrounding public policy. It's a long way of saying he believes God has a place on Capitol Hill and that the work of the Lord is important there, and that the people there deserve ministry as they think about how to live out their life of public service. These days, Dr. Schenck devotes his time to the newly established Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, which seeks to apply the insights of this brilliant World War II era pastor, theologian, and Christian ethicist to the social crises of our time. What I'd like to say is Rob has become a person that I respect, a person that I consider a colleague in the gospel, someone who I believe has been courageous on these issues and who has done the work that we all want to do and are doing, which is open himself up to the realities of what's happening and to take a courageous stand despite the cost. And he and Lucy, I think you will find, are both courageous people in that right. And so then just a few things about the film. In this gripping portrait of courage, director Abigail E. Disney follows the journey of an evangelical minister trying to find the moral strength to preach about the growing toll of gun violence in America. Along the way, Reverend Schenck meets Lucy McBath, the mother of Jordan Davis, an unarmed teenager who was murdered in Florida, and whose story has cast a spotlight on stand your ground laws. Also, an evangelical Christian, McBath's personal testimony compels Reverend Schenck to reach out to pastors around the country to discuss the moral and ethical response to gun violence. Lucy is on a difficult journey of her own, trying to make sense of her devastating loss while using her grief to effect some kind of viable and effective political action where so many before her have failed. The Armor of Light follows these allies through their trials of conscious heartbreak and rejection as they bravely attempt to make others consider America's gun culture through a moral lens. The film is a courageous look at our fractured political culture and an assertion that it is indeed possible for people to come together across deep party lines to find common ground. The film was released in 2015. It was selected to be shown at the Tribeca Film Festival, the Montclair Film Festival, received the Founders Prize at the Traverse Film Festival and the Hampton International Film Festival, just to say a few, and then won an Emmy for Outstanding Social Issue Documentary. Let us turn our attention to the screen. Thank you. Sitting in the audience, and I thought, it's ironic, actually, that I got more involved in this issue because of you. Which
I didn't know that.
Which has a little bit of irony to it, because I would not have expected a white evangelical conservative male to call me into these issues. I'm actually sitting looking at the screen going, I was probably like the guy in the four-way conversation who would have been like, that makes no sense. Guns kill people. No, people don't kill people. I mean, right? Some of you out there, come on. I know like there's a vast majority of you out there. You were like
That's
with
my
him.
hot-blooded colleague, Pat Mahoney, you see.
Thinking, that's right. But it's ironic because I think, just one of the reasons why I think we find this so important is I'm a person who's prayed about the issues. I could totally relate to Lucy. I'm a person who's outraged at the issues, but I think like lots of us going, what could be my next step? And going, God, how do you bring me towards a next step? And what does a next step look like? And so one of the things that I thought it might be great for you to just speak a little bit to in terms of your journey is some of the background, because we're seeing a moment. And when you watch it in an hour and 15 minutes, it can feel like a moment that you made a decision. And we're talking about this theme of perseverance and what it takes to get to change over time. And I would just love for you to talk a little bit about how you got there. What was this journey like? Give us a little bit more insight besides what we're seeing here on the screen as we think about our own lives and journey with this issue.
Well, if it wasn't obvious, I'm a recovering member of the religious right. So some of you will not like me as much after that, if you like me at all. But what you see in that film is 18 months of a journey for me in my encounter with Lucy. You see a very small slice of her agony and her drama. But overall, this was a 4-year project from start to how the film concludes. Now we've had 3 more years. So this is a 7-year journey. Maybe that rings a nice biblical bell for some of us. It, for me, has been a 7-year journey at least. And the background to this is I got a call one day asking me if I would have dinner with a filmmaker, Abigail Disney. And yes, the name went right over my head, believe it or not, went right over my head. I didn't put film and Disney together until halfway through the conversation. But I had been stung by filmmakers in the past, among them Alexandra Pelosi, if you've seen any of her documentaries, daughter of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who had mocked me in one of her award-winning films, and so I was a little skittish, but it sounded like an interesting evening, so I went with some fear and trepidation. And I met a person who has now become a very, very dear friend to me and partner in many ventures. And by the middle of the conversation, we were calling each other by first name, Abby and Rob. And Abby asked me, she said, how is it possible for your people, meaning white evangelicals, to be pro-life and so pro-gun? That was the question. And it was unsettling to me because I didn't register this as our problem, but in fact it is. white evangelicals are, as a subgroup in the population here in the US, the most likely group to support unfettered gun rights and to have access to or ownership of a firearm. So this problem belongs to my community. And it took me a long time to see it, but it came to a moment that you do not see on the film because the film crew was chased out of the room. But it was with a group of pastors, and we were around a table similar to one of the scenes you see in the film. If you remember those guys sitting from Ohio, it indicates. And they did not want the cameras or the microphones, so we excused the crew. And then we just had an honest conversation. And I asked this conference table full of pastors, all of them evangelical. We were in the South, but not the deep South. And I said, how many of you are armed? How many of you concealed carry? Every one of them raised their hand. Every pastor at the table, I'm going to say there were 15 or maybe closer to 20. Every one of them raised their hands. And I said, well, as a pastor, what is the process you go through to determine when to draw your weapon? And because of the way I was trained, some of you have undergone, professional firearms training, and you know that many trainers will tell you they will not train you unless you are ready to kill and kill in an instant, because if you aren't, then you become part of the problem. The gun will be taken from you in a violent confrontation. It will probably kill you and go on to kill others. So I said, in drawing the weapon, would you agree you are ready to kill? And they all agreed to, there was a consensus, yes, that's true. You must be ready to kill. I said, all right, as a pastor, as a shepherd of souls, please help me understand the process. How do you get to the killing point? And there was a lot of uncomfortable body language. And finally, one older gentleman, I'd put him in his mid-60s, said, well, I can tell you that. And I said, please, dear brother, help me. He said, well, that has to do with man's skin color. Skin color. And I said, skin color? Brother, please, tell me, help me. I'm not sure I understand. I'm not putting the two together. How does that relate here? He said, well, in many of our counties where we live, a colored man knows that if he comes into the county, he's asking for trouble, which makes him more dangerous than a white man. And that's when I'm going to draw my weapon and probably fire. He was a chaplain at a local hospital. And the reason that I tell you that is because while some of us kind of hope that this is theoretical, it is very real. And the struggle I have, and we prayed about this, Pastor Peter and just before we started Romanita and I prayed, because one of the great struggles I have is honoring all sides of this, including whether we would grant any space to this man or not. His fear was very real. He was very afraid. And his response in fear, however misdirected it was to arm himself to kill. And he had in his mind who was the greatest threat to him. This is a peculiar problem in the white evangelical world. And that's why we've taken it on, and it's a deep, complex, very long-term problem for us. I would say there's great hope in the under 40 leadership in the white evangelical churches. There's a very different response to this than in the older crowd. But this is something that will take great patience and a very difficult process. It's not easily resolved, I guess. So what you asked me about timing, this started 7 years ago and will likely be a project for the rest of my earthly life.
Wow. Thank you. It raises for me this thought, thinking about this context of one, clearly the film brings up the very real context of how politics plays into this. And then it subtly brings up, and then you overtly call out this reality of race. And so it's interesting to watch then your journey within your community around these issues of how people have connected guns and race and violence, and then watching Lucy's story of dealing with this from that same perspective, but then hearing those pastors at the Black church talk about this from the perspective of people coming in at a very local level into the hospital. And I guess the question that I have for you when you say this is uniquely our problem, then as we sit here as a community of people who are going, it's our problem too, right, who are agreeing with you going, and who some may be in all conscience going, yeah, it is your problem. We need you guys to get it right. Like, I know somebody out there thought that. They didn't say it, and they're like, I can't believe she said that. I did. But who are also going, we're experiencing this reality and this institutional support for a systemic system. I'm really curious as to what you're seeing in those places where you and Lucy are coming together with other communities. How are they engaging this issue? And then how are they engaging differently for the issues that they're facing? Kind of as you think about the long haul, because there's a long haul now with what needs to happen in the evangelical community. What are some of these other long hauls where people are having to persevere, and how might we see that through the work that Lucy's doing or others?
Well, you mentioned, and we have in our literature, another shameless promotion on the table, just in the center, in the back there. You'll read about our Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, and one of the reasons in the aftermath of the film that we launched the Bonhoeffer Institute is because Bonhoeffer gives us tools that we can employ in this long process. Most people think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You're familiar with my best dead friend, Dietrich. And if you've only known Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I'm talking about the World War II era pastor, young leader in Germany, very courageous, spoke out prophetically against the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, paid for it with his own life. It's a more complicated story than that, quite a bit more complicated. But if you only know him as a courageous martyr, you know, I like to say you know about 15% of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. 85% of him can be found in the 10,000 pages of Christian ethics and moral philosophy that he left for us in his legacy. And in my work, my research work on Bonhoeffer, I had the joy of meeting the last living person to have spoken to him before he was hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp. Hans von Hammerstein, at the time he was a 17-year-old catechism student who had been arrested by the Gestapo, was put in error on the same transport with Bonhoeffer, and ultimately to his hanging. The boy got off at a different site and survived the war, and I met him as an 87-year-old man. And what struck me was that this very, very sharp man at 87 had all of his mental faculties. And Hans von Hammerstein, he must have been brilliant as a 17-year-old, he said, it was very clear to me in my conversation with Pastor Bonhoeffer that he was looking forward to rebuilding the witness of the gospel in Germany after the collapse of the evangelical church. Remember that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the church in Germany was the Evangelische Kirche, the evangelical church of Germany. And it was that church that pronounced Adolf Hitler a gift and miracle from God, who would bring Germany back to greatness. That was the promise. Does it ring an awful bell for you? So Bonhoeffer was committed, even up to hours before his hanging, to a very long process of rebuilding the integrity of the witness of the evangelical church. And, you know, when we sit down with our team now and we look at this problem and we approach the problem, and we have been doing that very vigorously, we talk in terms of 30 and 100-year strategies. That long. So when you talk here, Pastor Peter, about the theme of perseverance, this is something, when we face something as big and consequential as this, as endemic, as catastrophic as it has been, we don't talk, as Peter said, we don't talk in terms of days or weeks. You mentioned it, but years and decades and maybe even centuries. So one of our team members said recently, look, we can do this. Give us 200 or 300 years, we will get this done. We will get this done. Well, you know, that's one kind of faith.
Yeah. Wow, well, we want to also give some time for some conversation from the audience. I think one of the things that has struck me is, I think as it relates to all of your people, Rob, if I can be honest about them, they have either been people who I have sort of not, I don't have to think about them, they don't affect my daily life, they're doing what they do, or they've been people that I've just clearly thought is wrong, they're wrong. And I think that one of the things that the film sort of calls to mind for me, and that I think the work you're doing when we talk about the other, is we have such a societal norm of the defeat of the other and not the transformation of the other. And transformation takes engagement. And transformation takes a different kind of approach than I think we often take in society. And I think if there's anything that has really struck a chord with me in watching the relationship between you and Lucy, it's this commitment that you all have to stand for the truth in graciousness, but to seek the transformation of other people and not the defeat of other people, in as much as I think they're wrong. But
see why she's a member of our circle of advisors?
We want to open it up for questions. Pastor Peter, would you like to come, and you want to make any comment before we have questions? Or okay.
Hi, my name's Troy. Two pretty heavy-duty, difficult topics, conflicts you've decided to tackle, pro-life and pro-gun. When I was in graduate school, I used to be, when it comes to the pro-life movement, I used to be sort of nonchalant about it. I didn't have strong feelings about abortion. I sort of thought, well, you know, I mean, I just didn't think about it, and I thought, what, you know, people should have a choice, whatever. And this isn't about that, but it was discussed in the film, and I actually had a conversation with a roommate who kind of changed my mind on that issue. We got into a long discussion, and I started to listen. You know, he was asking me questions of, well, when does conception begin? How do you know? Why would you ever not err on the side of caution? And the reason why I bring it up is because I really wonder how much success you feel like you've had in turning people's minds or changing people's minds.
On which?
Well, on the pro-gun issue, because that's what we're talking about.
We're just really 7 years into this. We're just seeing the first fruits of that. And of course, it's terrible for us to even contemplate, but with every incident like the recent Parkland High School shooting, it at least boots up the conscience for a moment, although we can't rely on those crises as our only opportunities. It has to be that when they occur, there's already foundational work there, and we're attempting to do that. You'll see again in the brochure that we have an actual Bible study series that we're promoting in churches so that church groups of various kinds, whole congregations, can take on an examination of this in an environment where we honor all sides. We don't take a position right out of the gate. It's an exploratory series. And we are starting to see some doubt creep in, and that's a good thing. So we're hearing from more and more who are saying, I'm starting to rethink this, or some that have said, I've gotten rid of the weapons I had in my house, or I can see now the deception that I was under here, and the fear that had possessed me, and the attitude I had about the lives of others. So we are beginning to see fruit to that. It comes very slowly, but we could use some help. So that's the other part of the brochure. It will tell you how you can join in this process and help us build more momentum. Thanks for asking.
Hi. Oh, sorry, is there? My name is Shaji. Thanks for your presentation over here. My question would be, it seems like you have an opportunity to talk about Christ and racism among the white evangelical church, and one could argue that you're using guns to talk about race, but we're basically not directly tackling the issue. That what you said before is that much of the emphasis on Second Amendment is this idea that white men or white people have a right to have gun ownership to intimidate or to control other people. So why did you choose guns rather than just being a Christian pastor that's moving the fight against racism?
Great question. And, we're learning, I'm learning as we go along. This was something very new to me. I had never examined this subject. And then when I started seeing the linkage, and it is so emotional that it does connect with people one way or the other. And in some ways, it allows us to get to some even more sensitive issues, which would be our attitude towards others, all kinds of others, certainly others in terms of race, color, ethnicity, religion. It helps us get there. So guns is just one of many portals into all those other areas, because for me, this is a moral and ethical crisis for the white Christian church at a dimension that, of course, it brings immediate consequences of life and death. So there is an urgency that people feel about it. There's a emotional connection. They're basically more or less knowledgeable about what it means, in their own minds at least, what it means to support the Second Amendment. So we get them to the table a little faster than I think if we put the race question right out. We may not get any conversation going at all. But we're learning as we go. Thank you for raising that.
Hi. So I grew up in the South, very conservative church, and my mom always told me the old covenant was nailed to the cross. We follow this new covenant, and one of the things that's kind of played out in my mind is how we kind of look at the U.S. Constitution as a new covenant, new set of laws that we live by, and I thought it was interesting in that video when people advocate to the Second Amendment, but they forget the law, thou shalt not kill. Is there any way we can start getting back to looking at the entire Bible and saying, hey, God set up the 10 Commandments, the first 10 Commandments, saying thou shalt not kill. God set up a new set of commandments saying thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There's this translation that needs to happen. How can we help spread that message of loving each other, loving thy neighbor?
Spoiler alert. If you do watch the rest of the film, you will see us discuss the problem that presents itself in venerating the Second Amendment. We risk violating the first commandment. You shall love God above all else. And then we explore the comparison between the second amendment and the second commandment on idolatry. And I do believe it helps to read Bonhoeffer on this, but I think even without his assistance, what we are talking about is a problem of idolatry. And where is idolatry? It's threaded all through the scripture, from the opening of Genesis all the way to Revelation. The problem of idolatry. And we have a crisis of idolatry within at least the white church. That's where I can speak from.
Maybe just one more, I think, because the 6 is on.
We just have to get this
Representing
young- Oh,
woman
sorry.
right here.
Can we get the young man just
Yeah.
after I want him to do that?
Pastor, you asked earlier if you like me at all. I just want to tell you that I like you. And I also want to tell you,
That's very
watching
humbling.
the video, you were a great listener, and you still are. And also, you were a good inquirer when people were giving answers. You were able to ask the questions again. Now, with that, I'm a daughter of an evangelical pastor and from an ethnic church. I'm asking for a counsel, really. You mentioned earlier about white evangelical older generation and the younger generation. And just speaking from my experience, it's somewhat true too with ethnic churches who are modeling after the evangelical churches. And so in that regard, being a good listener and inquirer, does Bonhoeffer Institute offer tidbits on like, these are the typical responses, and this is what you do? 10 breads and say this or something. I don't know. It would be so helpful for my household. Like, it starts with my family. So,
Thank you. I'm very humbled by your very kind words. Here's what I find both frustrating and enormously helpful about Bonhoeffer. He was really not a fan of formulaic responses. You just can't bullet point him. 3 things Bonhoeffer said we need to do, 5 things, 10 things. He saw the encounter between the gospel and reality, Christ and humanity, as enormously complex and dynamic. And so there were no static, formulaic principles for him. In fact, he posited, the central question, what does God expect of us in this moment of time? And that will not be the same as 2 moments ago or 3 moments ahead. But in this moment, what is God saying to us, and what does he require of us? So, yes, he does help, particularly pastors. Remember that Bonhoeffer was primarily a pastor to pastors. He was shaping and forming the church leadership in Germany at his time, and he had a great love for his seminarians. He continued to teach and care for them, even at great risk to his personal safety. So yes, and this is where we're going mostly with the Bonhoeffer Institute, is helping pastors to take an understanding of what Bonhoeffer was doing in his time and translate it into our time. So I would very much invite your daughter's participation with us, and your own, and everyone else. The more the merrier. Please come along. One final question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Caleb.
Hi.
Well, you certainly changed my perspective. I didn't have strong feelings on this before, but I guess I have stronger ones now. So have you ever talked to like kids like my age, 13, like, or lower?
I would
how
have
they
guessed
feel
you
about
out of
this?
24. But okay, I got you. I'll believe 15.
Have you like changed, and if so, have you changed their minds? Because
You know what I find about people your age? You're more open-minded and easier to talk to, even when you have strong opinions. You're not as sure that you're absolutely right. And this is what I think, at least one of the marks of a disciple is humility. Enough to say, I may not be right on this. And that goes for whatever side of the argument you're on. And that's part of listening deeply and honoring others. And that's what this really comes down to, maybe to put a kind of final word on it. And that is, this is really all about honoring the other. And it's very hard for me to imagine how we do that in my community when we approach the other ready, willing, and able to kill. It immediately shuts down the meaningful encounter with the other. And that, to me, is what Christ-like discipleship is all about. Thank you.